a WikiVidi documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. Henry John Temple, 3rd Viscount Palmerston. Henry John Temple, 3rd Viscount Palmerston, was a British statesman who served twice as Prime Minister in the mid-19th century. Palmerston dominated British foreign policy during the period 1830 to 1865, when Britain was at the height of her imperial power. He held office almost continuously from 1807 until his death in 1865. He began his parliamentary career as a Tory, defected to the Whigs in 1830, and became the first Prime Minister of the newly formed Liberal Party in 1859. Palmerston succeeded to his father's Irish peerage in 1802. He became a Tory MP in 1807. From 1809 to 1828 he served as Secretary at War, in which post he was responsible for the organisation of the finances of the army. He first attained cabinet rank in 1827, when George Canning became Prime Minister, but, like other Canningites, he resigned from office 1 year subsequently. He served as Foreign Secretary from 1830-34, from 1835-41, and from 1846-51. In this office, Palmerston responded efficaciously to a series of conflicts in Europe. His belligerent actions as Foreign Secretary, some of which were highly controversial, have been considered to be prototypes of the practice of liberal interventionism. Palmerston became Home Secretary in Aberdeen's coalition government in 1852, subsequent to the Peelite advocacy of the appointment of Lord John Russell to the office of Foreign Secretary. As Home Secretary, Palmerston enacted various social reforms, although he opposed electoral reform. When public antipathy over the government's policy in the Crimean War lost the government popular favour, in 1855, Palmerston was the only Prime Minister who was able to sustain a majority in Parliament. He had 2 periods in office, 1855, 1858 and 1859, 1865, before his death at the age of 80 years. A few months subsequent to victory in a general election in which he had achieved an increased majority. He remains, to date, the last Prime Minister to die in office. Palmerston masterfully controlled public opinion by stimulating British nationalism, and, despite the fact that Queen Victoria and most of the political leadership distrusted him, he received and sustained the favour of the press and the populace, from whom he received the affectionate sobriquet Pam. Palmerston's alleged weaknesses included mishandling of personal relations and continual disagreements with the Queen over the royal role in determining foreign policy. Historians consider Palmerston to be one of the greatest foreign secretaries, as a consequence of his handling of great crises. His commitment to the balance of power, which provided Britain with decisive agency in many conflicts, his analytic skills, and his commitment to British interests. His policies in relation to India, Italy, Belgium, and Spain had extensive long-lasting beneficial consequences for Britain, although the consequences of his policies toward France, the Ottoman Empire, and the United States were more ephemeral. Early life, 1784-1806. Henry John Temple was born in his family's Westminster house to the Irish branch of the Temple family on the 20th of October 1784. Henry was to become the 3rd Viscount Palmerston upon his father's death in 1802. His family derived their title from the peerage of Ireland, although the 3rd Viscount would almost never visit Ireland. His father was the 2nd Viscount Palmerston, an Anglo-Irish peer, and his mother was Mary, a daughter of Benjamin Mee, a London merchant. From 1792 to 1794, the young future Lord Palmerston accompanied his family on a long continental tour. Whilst in Italy, Palmerston acquired an Italian tutor, who taught him to speak and write fluent Italian. The family rarely visited their huge country estate in the north of County Sligo in the west of Ireland. He was educated at Harrow School. Admiral Sir Augustus Clifford, first BT was a fag to Palmerston, Viscount Althorp and Viscount Duncannon, and later remembered Palmerston as by far the most merciful of the three. Palmerston was often engaged in school fights, and fellow Old Harrovians remembered Palmerston as someone who stood up to bullies twice his size. Palmerston's father took him to the House of Commons in 1799, where young Palmerston shook hands with the Prime Minister, William Pitt. Palmerston was then at the University of Edinburgh, where he learnt political economy from Dugald Stewart, a friend of the Scottish philosophers Adam Ferguson and Adam Smith. Palmerston later described his time at Edinburgh as producing whatever useful knowledge and habits of mind I possess. Lord Minto wrote to Palmerston's parents that young Palmerston was well-mannered and charming. Stewart wrote to a friend, saying of Palmerston, "In point of temper and conduct he is everything his friends could wish. Indeed, I cannot say that I have ever seen a more faultless character at this time of life, or one possessed of more amiable dispositions." Palmerston succeeded his father to the title of Viscount Palmerston on the 17th of April 1802, before he had turned 18. The young third Lord Palmerston also inherited a vast country estate in the north of County Sligo in the west of Ireland. He later built Clarsea-Bourne Castle on this estate. Palmerston went to St John's College, Cambridge. As a nobleman, he was entitled to take his MA without examinations, but Palmerston wished to obtain his degree through examinations. This was declined, although he was allowed to take the separate college examinations, where he obtained first-class honours. After war was declared on France in 1803, Palmerston joined the volunteers mustered to oppose a French invasion. Being one of the 3 officers in the unit for St John's College, he was also appointed Lieutenant Colonel Commander of the Romsey Volunteers. Early political career, 1806–1809. In February 1806 Palmerston was defeated in the election for the University of Cambridge constituency. In November he was elected for Horsham, but was unseated in January 1807, when the Whig majority in the Commons voted for a petition to unseat him. Due to the patronage of Lord Chichester and Lord Malmesbury, he was given the post of Junior Lord of the Admiralty in the Ministry of the Duke of Portland. Palmerston stood again for the Cambridge seat in May, but he lost by 3 votes after he advised his supporters to vote for the other Tory candidate in the 2-member constituency so as to ensure a Tory was elected. Palmerston entered Parliament as Tory MP for the pocket borough of Newport on the Isle of Wight in June 1807. On the 3rd of February 1808 Palmerston spoke in support of confidentiality in the working of diplomacy, and the bombardment of Copenhagen and the capture and destruction of the Danish Navy by the Royal Navy in the Battle of Copenhagen. Denmark was neutral, but Napoleon had recently agreed with the Russians in the Treaty of Tilsit to build a naval alliance against Britain, including using the Danish Navy for invading Britain. Preempting this, the British offered Denmark the choice of temporarily handing over her navy until the war's end or the destruction of their navy. The Danes refused to comply and so Copenhagen was bombarded. Palmerston justified the attack by peroration with reference to the ambitions of Napoleon to take control of the Danish fleet. It is defensible on the ground that the enormous power of France enables her to coerce the weaker state to become an enemy of England. It is the law of self-preservation that England appeals for the justification of her proceedings. It is admitted by the honourable gentleman and his supporters, that if Denmark had evidenced any hostility towards this country, then we should have been justified in measures of retaliation. Denmark coerced into hostility stands in the same position as Denmark voluntarily hostile. When the law of self-preservation comes into play, does anyone believe that Bonaparte will be restrained by any considerations of justice from acting towards Denmark as he has done towards other countries? England, according to that law of self-preservation which is a fundamental principle of the law of nations, is justified in securing, and therefore enforcing, from Denmark a neutrality which France would by compulsion have converted into an active hostility. In a letter to a friend on the 24th of December 1807, Palmerston described the late Whig MP Edmund Burke as possessing the palm of political prophecy. This would become a metaphor for his own career in divining the course of imperial foreign policy. Secretary at War, 1809–1828. Palmerston's speech was so successful that Spencer Perceval, who formed his government in 1809, asked him to become Chancellor of the Exchequer. then a less important office than it was to become from the mid-19th century. Palmerston preferred the office of Secretary at War, charged exclusively with the financial business of the army. Without a seat in the cabinet until 1827, he remained in the latter post for 20 years. On the 1st of April 1818, a retired officer on half-pay, Lieutenant Davis, who had a grievance about his application from the War Office for a pension and was also mad, shot Palmerston as he walked up the stairs of the War Office. However, the bullet only grazed his back and the wound was slight. After Palmerston learned that Davis was mad, he paid for his legal defence at the trial. After the suicide of Castlereagh in 1822, the cabinet of Lord Liverpool's Tory administration began to split along political lines. The more liberal wing of the Tory government made some ground, with George Canning becoming Foreign Secretary and leader of the House of Commons, William Huskisson advocating and applying the doctrines of free trade, and Catholic emancipation emerging as an open question. Although Palmerston was not in the cabinet, he cordially supported the measures of Canning and his friends. Upon the retirement of Lord Liverpool in April 1827, Canning was called to be Prime Minister. The more conservative Tories, including Sir Robert Peel, withdrew their support, and an alliance was formed between the Liberal members of the late ministry and the Whigs. The post of Chancellor of the Exchequer was offered to Palmerston, who accepted it, but this appointment was frustrated by some intrigue between the King and John Charles Herries. Palmerston remained Secretary at War, though he gained a seat in the cabinet for the first time. The Canning administration ended after only 4 months on the death of the Prime Minister, and was followed by the Ministry of Lord Goderich, which barely survived the year. The Canningites remained influential, and the Duke of Wellington hastened to include Palmerston, Huskisson, Charles Grant, William Lamb, and the Earl of Dudley in the government he subsequently formed. However, a dispute between Wellington and Huskisson over the issue of parliamentary representation for Manchester and Birmingham led to the resignation of Huskisson and his allies, including Palmerston. In the spring of 1828, after more than 20 years continuously in office, Palmerston found himself in opposition. On the 26th of February 1828, Palmerston delivered a speech in favour of Catholic emancipation. He felt that it was unseemly to relieve the imaginary grievances of the dissenters from the established church while at the same time real afflictions pressed upon the Catholics of Great Britain. Palmerston also supported the campaign to pass the Reform Bill to extend the franchise to more men in Britain. One of his biographers has stated that, like many Pittits, now labelled Tories, he was a good Whig at heart. The Roman Catholic Relief Act 1829 finally passed Parliament in 1829 when Palmerston was in the opposition. The Great Reform Act passed Parliament in 1832. Opposition, 1828-1830. Following his move to opposition, Palmerston appears to have focused closely on foreign policy. He had already urged Wellington into active interference in the Greek War of Independence, and he had made several visits to Paris, where he foresaw with great accuracy the impending overthrow of the Bourbons. On the 1st of June 1829 he made his first great speech on foreign affairs. An attempt was made by the Duke of Wellington in September 1830 to induce Palmerston to re-enter the cabinet, but he refused to do so without Lord Lansdowne and Lord Grey, two notable Whigs. This can be said to be the point in 1830 when his party allegiance changed. Crises of 1830. The revolutions of 1830 gave a jolt to the settled European system that had been created in 1814-15. The United Kingdom of the Netherlands was rent in half by the Belgian Revolution. The Kingdom of Portugal was the scene of civil war, and the Spanish were about to place an infant princess on the throne. Poland was in arms against the Russian Empire, while the northern powers formed a closer alliance that seemed to threaten the peace and liberties of Europe. Polish exiles called on Britain to intervene against Russia during the November Uprising of 1830. Palmerston's overall policy was to safeguard British interests, maintain peace, keep the balance of power, and retain the status quo in Europe. He had no grievance against Russia, and while he privately sympathized with the Polish cause, in his role as foreign minister he rejected Polish demands. With serious trouble simultaneously taking place in Belgium and Italy, and lesser issues in Greece, and Portugal, he sought to de-escalate European tensions rather than aggravate them. He therefore focused chiefly on achieving a peaceful settlement of the crisis in Belgium. William I of the Netherlands appealed to the great powers that had placed him on the throne after the Napoleonic Wars to maintain his rights. The London Conference of 1830 was called to address this question. The British solution involved the independence of Belgium, which Palmerston believed would greatly contribute to the security of Britain, but any solution was not straightforward. On the one hand, the northern powers were anxious to defend William I. On the other, many Belgian revolutionaries, like Charles de Broukère and Charles Rogier, supported the reunion of the Belgian provinces to France. The British policy was a close alliance with France, but one subject to the balance of power on the continent, and in particular the preservation of Belgium. If the northern powers supported William I by force, they would encounter the resistance of France and Britain united in arms. If France sought to annex Belgium, it would forfeit the British alliance and find herself opposed by the whole of Europe. In the end, the British policy prevailed. Although the continent had been close to war, peace was maintained on London's terms, and Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, the widower of a British princess, was placed upon the throne of Belgium. France, Spain and Portugal 1830s. In 1833 and 1834 the youthful Queens Isabella II of Spain and Maria II of Portugal were the representatives and the hope of the constitutional parties of their countries. Their positions were under some pressure from their absolutist kinsmen, Dom Miguel of Portugal and Don Carlos of Spain, who were the closest males in the lines of succession. Palmerston conceived and executed the plan of a quadruple alliance of the constitutional states of the West to serve as a counterpoise to the Northern Alliance. A treaty for the pacification of the peninsula was signed in London on the 22nd of April 1834 and, although the struggle was somewhat prolonged in Spain, it accomplished its objective. France had been a reluctant party to the treaty, and never executed her role in it with much zeal. Louis-Philippe was accused of secretly favouring the Carlists, the supporters of Don Carlos, and he rejected direct interference in Spain. It is probable that the hesitation of the French court on this question was one of the causes of the enduring personal hostility Palmerston showed towards the French king thereafter, though that sentiment may well have arisen earlier. Although Palmerston wrote in June 1834 that Paris was the pivot of my foreign policy, the differences between the two countries grew into a constant but sterile rivalry that brought benefit to neither. Balkans and Near East, defending Turkey, 1830s. Palmerston was greatly interested by the diplomatic questions of Eastern Europe. During the Greek War of Independence he had energetically supported the Greek cause and backed the Treaty of Constantinople that gave Greece its independence. However, from 1830 the defense of the Ottoman Empire became one of the cardinal objects of his policy. He believed in the regeneration of Turkey. As he wrote to Bulwer, all that we hear about the decay of the Turkish Empire, and its being a dead body or a sapless trunk, and so forth, is pure unadulterated nonsense. His two great aims were to prevent Russia establishing itself on the Bosporus and to prevent France doing likewise on the Nile. He regarded the maintenance of the authority of the Sublime Porte as the chief barrier against both these developments. Palmerston had long maintained a suspicious and hostile attitude towards Russia, whose autocratic government offended his liberal principles and whose ever-growing size challenged the strength of the British Empire. He was angered by the 1833 Treaty of Hunkariskelisi, a mutual assistance pact between Russia and the Ottomans, but was annoyed and hostile towards David Urquhart, the creator of the Vixen Affair, running the Russian blockade of Circassia in the mid-1830s. Despite his popular reputation, he was hesitant in 1831 about aiding the Sultan of Turkey, who was under threat from Muhammad Ali, the Pasha of Egypt. Later, after Russian successes, in 1833 and 1835 he made proposals to afford material aid, which were overruled by the cabinet. Palmerston held that, if we can procure for it 10 years of peace under the joint protection of the five powers, and if those years are profitably employed in reorganizing the internal system of the empire, there is no reason whatever why it should not become again a respectable power, and challenged the metaphor that an old country such as Turkey should be in such disrepair as would be warranted by the comparison. Half the wrong conclusions at which mankind arrive are reached by the abuse of metaphors, and by mistaking general resemblance or imaginary similarity for real identity. However, when the power of Muhammad Ali appeared to threaten the existence of the Ottoman dynasty, particularly given the death of Sultan Mahmud II on 1 July 1839, he succeeded in bringing the great powers together to sign a collective note on 27 July pledging them to maintain the independence and integrity of the Turkish Empire in order to preserve the security and peace of Europe. However, by 1840 Muhammad Ali had occupied Syria and won the Battle of Nezab against the Turkish forces. Lord Ponsonby, the British ambassador at Constantinople, vehemently urged the British government to intervene. Having closer ties to the Pasha than most, France refused to be a party to coercive measures against him despite having signed the note in the previous year. Palmerston, irritated at France's Egyptian policy, signed the London Convention of 15 July 1840 in London with Austria, Russia and Prussia without the knowledge of the French government. This measure was taken with great hesitation and strong opposition on the part of several members of the cabinet. Palmerston forced the measure through in part by declaring in a letter to the Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, that he would resign from the ministry if his policy were not adopted. The London Convention granted Muhammad Ali hereditary rule in Egypt in return for withdrawal from Syria and Lebanon, but was rejected by the Pasha. The European powers intervened with force, and the bombardment of Beirut, the fall of Acre, and the total collapse of Muhammad Ali's power followed in rapid succession. Palmerston's policy was triumphant, and the author of it had won a reputation as one of the most powerful statesmen of the age. In September 1838, Palmerston appointed a British consul in Jerusalem, without the conventional consultation of the Board of Trade, and gave instruction to assist with the construction of an Anglican church in the city, under the prompting influences of Lord Shaftesbury, a prominent Christian Zionist. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Would you like to know more?